Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, our third Wicked webinar series today, and I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction to allow people to turn up with maybe their cup of tea after their lunch break. Today we're going to cover the topic of fake news, the challenge of communicating environmental and climate change research. And I think although we've gone with these particular research topics, obviously communicating science and debunking the myths, it will probably be a topic that covers lots of what we do. So lots from these two excellent speakers, as well as the discussions that will follow. We have two speakers today, and I think we'll have a real great discussion with them today. The first speaker is Tracey Brown, who is Director of Sense About Science. And under her leadership, the charity has turned the case around for sound science and evidence into popular campaigns to urge scientific thinking among the public and the people who answer to them. And we also have Professor Steve Lewandowski, who is Chair of Cognitive Psychology at the School of Psychological Sciences at Bristol University. His recent research has focused on the public's understanding of science and why people embrace beliefs that are often at odds with the scientific evidence. So we're going to allow a couple of people more to join in before we hand over. We will ask people to use the chat function, and we will make sure the camera is on the speaker rather than looking at all of us. Please do put your comments in chat, and I'll try and moderate and keep an eye on the questions to help field the questions in this time we'll have at the end. And of course, any questions that we can't get to, we'll try and get Tracey and Steve to comment on them after the fact, if they don't mind, and that would be great. Okay, I think, assuming we've got a couple more that will turn up, I'm going to hand over to Tracey to start while I unmute and to turn off myself. Tracey will present her slides now, and I'm hoping Jess and Gemma are on.
Okay, thank you very much, Eileen. Are we on? Can you just confirm to me that we're on?
I can see your slides. They're not in presentation mode yet, though.
Are they now? How are we doing?
Not yet.
I've got a pause note, I'm afraid, Eileen. Let me try again.
Oh, no, something happening.
Okay, fantastic. We're so expert at this after so many formats.
Too many
anyway.
Software.
Good afternoon. If you don't know Sense About Science, then we promote the public interest in sound science and evidence. That means we don't advocate for the science budget or for particular science interests or applications of science. What we're interested in is equipping people with the kind of questions they need to get to the bottom of how the world around them is working. We do that around specific issues. This is one that was first published in 2008. You can imagine just how pertinent some of those questions are now for us. We deal with communities all over in the case of the UK, all over the UK, from the Scouts to Mumsnet to local youth groups and right through to national policymakers and politicians and the media. What we do is we equip people with the kind of questions that enable them to get behind things that they see and they read. That includes in advertising, in policy statements, in the way that decisions are made around their lives, and so on. So you can imagine that data science is a very big part of that for us now, particularly those complex issues where it's very difficult for people to break down the questions. But we also equip them to go out and do it themselves, and we mobilise people to ask for evidence, which is a campaign that we've been running in beta format for some years now, and it's taking out onto a big campaign over the next year. And from that, we see all sorts of interesting ways in which people themselves ask for evidence around issues that perhaps most of the science community wouldn't notice. So we have quite a big bank of experience in public-driven questioning around scientific issues. What we also do is we mobilise the research community and the public together to have a good conversation about research, but also to push for system change when things aren't right. And this is one of our major campaigns globally that's resulted in laws being changed from the FDA in the US to the EU's clinical trials registration. We've got changes in the law that mean that all results from clinical trials have to be reported. So we have very effective global and national campaigns working with people. And I mention that because I want, first of all, to establish with you that the public can be mobilised to change major areas of practice around getting the evidence, getting our hands on the evidence. And for me, the kind of post-truth narrative only rings part true about the kind of world that we live in, and as does the fake news narrative, because what I'm exposed to all the time is a quest for truth among the public and many of the organisations that we interact with. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today, in a sense, I'm the good news fairy. I'm actually not going to wring my hands and talk about the prevalence of fake news and the problem of this. One of the reasons for why is that I think that the research community quite often steps back and spends a lot of time in angst and hand-wringing and analysis about the public, rather than just rolling up their sleeves and getting out and doing. And then in getting out and doing, you learn what there is to play for. And what there is to play for is often a great deal more than people can think by looking at the sorts of stories they read in the newspapers or seeing the slightly more outrageous and outraged stuff that they get online. So what I'm going to go through today is a really rapid fire tour of some of the things that we have interacted with, and taking some of the hard end, because we work very much at the hard end of discussions about research and society. This has included even some quite esoteric areas that we've worked on. When we wrote the principles for the treatment of independent science advice, which went into the ministerial code in this country in 2010, even a campaign as esoteric as that, how should science advice be given to government, how to protect the academic and freedom and independence of operation of people who give that advice, was something that garnered something of a mass campaign. So I just sort of put that there as even something that you might think is only for policy wonks. We managed to get a lot of public support behind. Now, I know that it's not easy, and so a couple of the things that I want to reflect on first of all with you is, yeah, engaging with uncertainty is difficult. And here is a summary of actually the things that we found very useful. I think engaging with uncertainty is what researchers often find the most off-putting. They're very scared of being asked, well, is it or isn't it? Are you certain? Or you're not certain, are you? And then they're very nervous about that uncertainty being blown up and weaponized, a theme that I think Steve might pick up, and he's certainly dealt with often. They're particularly concerned about this in the climate arena, where we've seen that the use of uncertainty is to try and poke holes in the dominant direction of the research and the evidence. But we actually find it's quite possible when talking to people to address some of these issues. I think the first thing is preempting it with, it doesn't mean we know nothing. It also doesn't mean that anything could be true. So the fact that we don't know everything there is to know, which is why we do research, obviously we wouldn't be doing research if we knew everything. But it doesn't mean that the fact that we don't know everything doesn't mean that somebody's pet theory or a rather mystical solution to it could be true. What we also find it useful to talk about is confidence and levels of confidence that we have in different types of evidence. And I think that's often missing from research communications. The other thing that I think I would like to invite everyone I speak to at the moment to kind of join in with a bit more is to talk about operational knowledge. Do we know enough to do the thing we want to do? Can the evidence that we're looking at bear the weight that we want to put on it? Newtonian physics didn't explain everything we need to know about how the universe works, certainly not as much as Einstein, but they were enough to put a man on the moon. I think that's quite useful to point out to people from time to time. And where we want to shift people to, and this is a work in progress, is not asking, are you certain? But are you certain that if new information comes along, you're in a position to adjust to that? And I think that's quite a legitimate question for people to ask. The other thing that we spend a lot of our time doing is actually trying to break down conspiracy theories, and I don't think it's just like attacking conspiracy theories or going out to the fringes, but actually a kind of more conspiratorial approach, and encourage people that critical questions will get them a lot further than withdrawn cynicism. And so these are the sorts of things that we have put out to the research community, encouraging them to actually have a more respectful conversation about conspiracy theories, to see how far you can go with giving people useful critical questions rather than simply rebutting them with authority. And we advise very strongly against rebutting with authority. I know it's been fashionable, and at times it has worked, for example, to get attention to the consensus around climate change. It was certainly a moment of change when many leading scientists sign a letter to say this is what they think, and we can point to all of the scientific bodies being in favour, for example, of the use of GMOs in place of chemical solutions in agriculture. And those things do open doors and cause people to pause and ask questions. But I think there's a limit to what you can do and it's very much exposed by our current COVID situation. There's a real limit to an appeal to authority. And instead, I think we need to actually work out, how do you equip people with better critical questioning? I'm actually going to skip these because I think we can come back to those in discussion if people want to talk a little bit more about the uncertainty thing. Now, people often feel quite inspired when I talk to them about the work Sense About Science does, but then they kind of sidle up to me over coffee or drinks later and say, yeah, but my issue is a bit different from that. The area I research in, I just can't engage people. Some issues are just too complex. How could I even how can I even speak to them when they haven't got PhDs, as one geologist once said to me. But I think people, even to some degree, feel a little bit like daunted at the thought of having a very different starting point from the people that they're talking to. But here's an example of something that was incredibly complex, very relevant today. We worked with the Small Area Health Statistics Unit at Imperial, who were publishing the maps of them monitoring health conditions and environmental agents. This is something that they do at ward level. The data is really complex, really detailed rather. And of course, there's a huge danger in publishing these, as they did in an atlas that was then useful for other researchers, practitioners. Real danger that councillors at ward level or local journalists might look at these, overlay the maps and decide that this hotspot here has got a lot of breast cancer, this hotspot here also has a lot of incinerators, therefore there's a causal relationship. What we did for this was we got those people, those councillors, a few of the councillors, a few of the local journalists in to help us design the interface with these, and they worked with the Small Area Health Statistics Unit in Imperial to actually design how these maps appeared, what kind of supplementary information, what kind of questions there were, how that was layered. They were very productive, and in fact so much so that it became quite a popular website and crashed when it launched, but the coverage of it was incredibly mature and balanced and sensible, and something that just looked like a recipe for every awful press story you ever imagined actually turned out rather well. Here is probably the most complex communication and interface with research that you could imagine. This is the late David Mackay's global calculator for global emissions and meeting targets. This is something which has behind it the most complex data sets, and not everything from transport to agriculture and everything we know about emissions and energy production and so on. And this is basically a kind of dashboard that you can mess around with. So if you were Greenpeace, you would perhaps get rid of nuclear on here and increase renewables. If you were Shell, you would perhaps get rid of nuclear and increase renewables as well. But basically you can plot a map through this to see how can we reach emissions targets. And this interface, whilst it's really unfriendly and it very obviously is made by Cambridge University, in my view, it is actually only about 20 minutes before pretty much any member of the public can work out what's behind it and how to chart a path through it. And I think it's one of the most complex propositions that we've ever dealt with. People also say, aren't some issues just too sensitive? And here's something that we faced with the outcomes of children's heart surgery, very political in the UK because of the Bristol Hearts scandal and the Alder-Hey hospital scandal and retention of organs and so on. And we engaged the parents of children undergoing heart surgery to help to express the data on heart surgery outcomes, which was something that the government committed to do following those scandals. As a result of their engagement, they actually ended up taking over the whole web interface and layering the information in a way that really worked for people, and as a result became the biggest champions of that research, despite it starting from a total standoff between the surgeons and the parents. Isn't it too late is another question I'm frequently asked. My issues can become so polarised, you can't pull people back, everyone's really tribal on it, and so on. And GMOs was very much like that, genetically modified organisms very much like that around a decade ago. And in fact, if some of you may be old enough to remember that in 2012 there was an attack on Rothamsted research stations research into aphid-resistant GM wheat. A big story went around that it was using a cow gene, and therefore the wheat was part cow and all sorts of other things. And there was an announced attack before, in May 2012, there was an announced attack that they're going to go and pull it all up. It was risking all sorts of other experiments like park grass, which is one of the longest running ecological experiment in the world, which was right near the site and would have been damaged if they turned up in thousands, as it looked like they were going to do. We have got the scientists to appeal directly to the public on this, and they launched a video, a very shonky, very self-made video that just talked about their research and why they're doing it in a heartfelt plea, and talked about their environmental credentials, what they were trying to achieve by it. They didn't try to be like the public. They didn't try and kind of get down with the public in that video. They just talked about why they were so motivated about their research. And the result of that video was an outpouring of public support. Over 6,000 people posted on a wall that we put up for them. It changed the way that the government responded. Instead of dogs and barbed wire, they actually accepted that the researchers should be out in the site talking to people on the day of the planned protest. Every single newspaper ran a supportive editorial supporting public sector research in this area, even those that had previously been really, really hostile to research of this kind. And the result of it was that actually around 140 people showed up instead of the sort of 5,000 that were expected, and most of them were really probably the press looking for the people who were showing up. So the result of that was that actually a really different approach, and they turned around the public discussion. And I mention that because I think that even in those areas where you might feel there's a lost cause, a lot of the time we haven't actually got into sufficient conversations to see what's possible in terms of resetting the agenda, the nuance in the discussion. And I worry that people rush too quickly to categorise everyone. Good example of that right now is people being asked whether they're pro or anti-vaccine around COVID. It's far too soon to ask people that question. I personally would be anti-vaccine if it's one that hasn't been fully tested and is one of the ones that currently is available in some countries of the world. So I think we need to be very, very careful in entering into public engagement, that we don't set an agenda for ourselves that is fearful and overly categorises people, puts them away from us before we've even had a chance to get close to them. Thank you.
And now we are going to seamlessly, hopefully, hand over to Stephen to give his part of the presentation. If I ask Tracey to shut down her webcam for Steve's talk. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just trying to get the, there we go, hang on. I just need to choose the right window. There we are.
Perfect, Steve. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit more about COVID, the present situation, rather than climate change, although a lot of the things I have to talk about also clearly apply to climate change. And it's very interesting that Tracey just mentioned that she doesn't just want to talk about doom and gloom, and she doesn't want to be, the bearer of bad news all the time. And actually, that is precisely what I want to say as well, because what COVID has done is to crystallize two opposing trends. And what I want to do is I want to go through both of those trends right now, starting out with the sort of conventional view that COVID has given rise to an infodemic, this sort of outbreak of misinformation and conspiracy theorizing and so on, which people tend to emphasize a great deal in the media and in public. And indeed, there's evidence for that. Here is just one of a number of recent studies by researchers, social scientists who surveyed the public for their opinions. And what Freeman et al. Found was that about a quarter of the UK public is consistently or strongly endorsing conspiratorial coronavirus beliefs. So they think it's a hoax, or they think it is man-made. Sometimes they believe in both of those propositions, even though they're mutually exclusive. So there clearly is a segment of the population in the UK, but also other countries, who do believe in conspiracy theories surrounding COVID. And indeed, it's not just COVID. You find similar conspiracist beliefs surrounding pretty much any other scientific issue, including climate change, GMOs, vaccinations in particular. And they're not harmless, because when you then look at what the consequences are of conspiratorial beliefs surrounding scientific issues, then you find that they're associated with a number of different adverse consequences for society. So, for example, in the case of COVID, it's been found that people who hold conspiratorial beliefs about COVID are willing to engage in violence, or are endorsing the violence of others. For example, surrounding 5G installations. And you may recall earlier this year that there has been a large number of arson attacks on 5G installations based on the conspiracy theory that COVID somehow was caused by 5G, which of course it was not. Moreover, even aside from these extreme cases, there's evidence that conspiratorial thinking is associated with reduced compliance, compliance with social distancing, compliance with quarantining, with hygiene instructions, and most recently, with wearing masks. And it turns out that all of these consequences and conspiratorial attitudes are associated with a reliance on social media to obtain information about COVID. And that's another theme that is permeating other scientific issues as well, that the reliance on social media very often is associated with an increase in conspiratorial attitudes towards scientific issues. And given that from here on out, our best hope to get the pandemic under control is a vaccine that now appears to be on the horizon, a reduced intention to vaccinate can be ultimately problematic. Although I totally agree with Tracey, who said that right at the moment, she might not even accept that a vaccine is safe enough until it has been fully tested. So Perhaps it's premature to worry about it, but knowing what we know about how much of anti-vaccination beliefs are driven by conspiratorial thoughts, I think this is at least potentially reason for concern. Well, that was the one side of the equation, and there's, quite a bit of data out there to support that aspect of what COVID-19 has done. However, there is another side to the story, and that is what COVID has done is to actually increase trust in scientists. And here are some data for that. First, perhaps the most impressive data and broadest data, largest database comes from Germany, where what's happened is that the trust in scientists has virtually tripled compared to previous years as a function of the pandemic. So if you look at these data here, it turns out that red and orange are the good responses. Those are the percentages of people who trust scientists completely or partially. Time goes from top to bottom. What you can see here is that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of people who trust scientists early this year as a function of the pandemic. Now, and that's not an isolated case. You get precisely the same result also in the United Kingdom. These are data from May this year, where 64% of the public, said that they're now more likely to listen to expert advice from qualified scientists and researchers compared to prior to the pandemic. So that's interesting because what it suggests is that while some people resort to conspiracy theories in times of uncertainty, and we know that any uncertain time will inevitably give rise to conspiracy theories, while some people resort to conspiracy theories, not everybody does. We have what I would call a very striking bifurcation. The bifurcation between the majority of people in most countries we've looked at, where the population accepts and trusts science. And in fact, in the German data that I just alluded to, there's other evidence to suggest that people are actually very happy to accept uncertainty and controversy because they feel that if scientists disagree initially, that having that disagreement simply means that sooner or later the right answer is going to emerge out of this discussion. So again, as Tracey was saying, uncertainty is something that the public actually very often is able to deal with. And in the case of COVID, the majority of people are able to deal with that. However, there's also another segment of the population, smaller than that majority, but nonetheless notable, who endorse conspiratorial narratives. And we've already seen some data on that as well. And at this point, I think it's very important to underscore two things. Number one, if you look at what conspiracy theorizing actually is, well, it turns out it is the antithesis to scientific reasoning. Scientists test hypotheses, conspiracy theorists confirm them because they know ahead of time that something must be wrong, and therefore they set out to confirm their intense suspicion of science, health authorities, and the government. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that wherever you look, science denial is associated with an endorsement of conspiracies. It doesn't matter whether you look at vaccinations, smoking and lung cancer, HIV and AIDS, GMOs, climate change, nanotechnology, wherever you look, and now, of course, COVID as well, wherever you look, the more people endorse conspiracies, the less likely they are to accept the science. And the numbers that I'm showing you here are correlation coefficients. The fact that they're negative means the more you believe in conspiracies, the less you believe in science. And the magnitude indicates the strength of that relationship. And when you get to the point of around 0.5, that is actually a whopping relationship for variables in the social sciences. So science denial inevitably involves conspiracies. But why? Why do people resort to conspiratorial thought? Well, this is where it gets to be very interesting and nuanced, because I think we have to further subdivide the group of people who believe in conspiracy theories into two attributes or two roots to that belief. One is what I call dispositional, and that is that there are some people out there who are just predisposed to believe in conspiracies, or who are prone to accept conspiracies. And we know that because, first of all, we can predict their belief on the basis of other personality variables that are themselves very stable over time. And also because for those people, if you know that they believe in one conspiracy theory, you can also make a very good guess that they'll believe in others. Chemtrails, COVID, climate denial, those things very often tend to go hand in hand. And indeed, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence of the relationship. Well, beyond anecdotal, actually, if you just count the number of people articulating both conspiracies against climate change and against the scientific evidence underlying COVID-19. So that's one way by which people can get to this conspiratorial state of affairs. But there is another route, and I think that is important to understand. And this other route is what I call pragmatic. People are not predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories, but they resort to conspiratorial rhetoric when their worldview is being threatened. So, for example, we have data from my laboratory, a study that is currently being published, where I can show that people who are believers in the free market, who endorse the idea of unregulated, laissez-faire business as usual, they are threatened by climate change, not because of climate change, but because of what our response to climate change would entail, namely a reduction in CO2 emissions, and hence a tax on carbon or some regulation or some other interference with business as usual. And it is that threat to their worldview that will then deploy the rhetorical device to call climate change a hoax or a conspiracy among scientists. And this is triggered not because these people are predisposed to believe in conspiracies, but because their worldview is threatened, and they get off the hook by postulating a conspiracy among climate scientists. And arguably the same is true with COVID-19. The problem is that a lot of the people who endorse conspiratorial alternatives may do so because it gets them off the hook. You don't have to wear masks. You don't have to stay at home. You can go to the pub. You can hang out with your friends. You can go to parties, provided you convince yourself that COVID is a hoax, or that it's not at all dangerous, or the government is overstating it, or masks do nothing to prevent the spread, etc., etc. And so when it boils down to looking at people who engage in conspiratorial rhetoric, then you have to further subdivide between those who engage in the rhetoric for pragmatic reasons because it is helpful rhetorically, and those who are indeed deeply committed to the conspiracies and who believe in a number of conspiracies, and for whom that is dispositional based on personality variables, such as the propensity to think that truth is best established by intuition rather than evidence. You know, there's a number of variables that we know of that tell us whether people are predisposed to conspiracy theories. And of course, another such variable is that getting into a conspiracy theory offers, ironically perhaps, psychological relief. Because if you think that COVID was created by some really bad people like George Soros or Al Gore or Bill Gates, then it might give you that sort of sense of control because you can blame a culprit rather than accepting that it was pretty much a random event of a virus transmitting most likely from a bat to human beings. Now, what does that tell us? How can we sum all that up? Well, there's a lot to be said about that as well. I don't have time to get into the details, but basically very different communication strategies apply to people who are engaging in conspiratorial rhetoric as a function of, because it is a rhetorical device, versus those who are dispositionally inclined to that. As it turns out, my colleague John Cook and I published a handbook earlier this year, which is available at that link given there, that goes into this in much greater detail, and by now in 8 different languages, and explains how you can respond to people who engage in such conspiracies, be it in the context of COVID or climate change or vaccinations, because as I've shown, the role of conspiracy theories is very broad when it comes to science denial. And I can get into the specifics if anyone is interested, maybe later during the question period, but I think for now my time is up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and Tracey is back online there. Hopefully everyone can hear all 3 of us and see us. I have been keeping an eye on the questions, but there's probably time to deal with more, so come on audience, get your questions going there. I think we'll do them in discussion. Some of them may be more relevant to one or other of the speakers, but I'll allow Tracey and Steve to do that. Tracey, during your talk, question came in from Eleanor Moore, our questioner of the day today. What are the lessons that you think we have learned from communications around coronavirus? Oh, you're muted, Tracey, just give me a second.
You're still muted, Tracey.
You need to unmute me there. I'm back in the studio. Okay, thank you. Sorry, can you repeat the question, Eileen? Because I was desperately trying to unmute at that moment.
No, that's fine. What are the lessons that you think we have learned from communications about coronavirus?
Wow, many of them. I think one of the lessons I think is I'd say 2 things stand out for me. One is helping people to ask questions. It's actually quite difficult. People's questions come, I mean, you know, Steve's just been through some examples really where they come often with a kind of combination of an objection or confusion. It's like, I've just been asked to do this thing. I've been asked to kind of modify my life in some big way. I kind of want to understand that. Understandably, there has actually been a lot of confusion because some of that isn't, has come from political vacillation about things and changes and lack of explanations and so on, and in some cases some fairly questionable material. I mean, if you are paying attention to the evidence around COVID, you'll know that actually being on the beach was a really cool idea as a way of not spreading the virus when you're hanging out with other people in the UV of midsummer on a beach in open air. Far better idea than having a couple of people around your house. But that wasn't the message that was coming across in public life and in the media. So So I think legitimately people had all sorts of questions that they were all muddled up. So helping people to ask questions in a way that gets them to something they need to know. And I think that has been for us very challenging because most of the people asking those questions are not the science interested. They're not people who go to Saturday morning science museum events and that kind of thing. And so even finding the language with which to ask questions and to know where to put them, and to know what different bodies are, or different, you know, to know what epidemiology is, for example. So the basic architecture is missing for a lot of people, even to get into discussion. So that's, I think, something that, and on the other side of that, unfortunately, people go native really quickly when they get into an issue. So what they do is they start talking in acronyms. People who are in the research world who are interacting with policy start just speaking as though we all know exactly what all these arm's length bodies in government do. Even half of government doesn't know what they do. So I mean, it's kind of a not fair assumption on the public. So I think that's been problematic and challenging. And I think the other thing that has been frustrating has been the anti-misinformation charge, particularly when it's led from authority, which is a different thing from leading it from the ground up. When it's led from authority, it's felt like it's about shutting down discussion rather than putting good information in its place. So, you know, it was stark at the time that the Cabinet Office announced its clampdown on misinformation, was right around the time that it was also, the government was also disputing publishing its own research base. So I think that's been really challenging to be in our position, certainly, and for a lot of researchers. On the one hand, trying to kind of get people to look to authoritative sources, and on the other, knowing that the authoritative sources were being very secretive.
Yeah, and Steve, anything you would want to add, a sort of major lesson we've learned in communication?
I largely agree with that, and in particular, the secrecy initially in the UK was stunning. In particular, also because the recommendations that came out of these secret meetings were completely at odds with, you know, every other scientific body in the world at the time. So there was a sort of a double whammy of lack of transparency and coming up with things that were just unbelievable to anybody who listened to other scientific sources. So I think that's a very good point to pick up on that. And one of the two interesting things. First of all, in other countries, it was far more transparent, and they came up with other advice early on. And those countries have done better in managing the pandemic, at least in the initial phases. And the second thing is that one interesting thing that's happened in the UK in consequence to that is the establishment of the independence age, which was brought into life because of the secrecy, and which from the beginning had transparency as its goal. And now I don't want to get into the dispute of, you know, the between those different camps, but the point is that ultimately, perhaps as a consequence of that, the official scientific advice was also made much more transparent, and I think that that was a very positive thing. However, I hate to be too critical of what's going on in the UK, but unfortunately it's unavoidable, because the further problem, I think, has been a very inconsistent and haphazard messaging on the part of the government. And you know, I mean, early on, it was sort of comprehensible. Stay home, stay safe. That was easy. I understood that. But that was a long time ago. And ever since, I've ceased to understand what they're actually saying. And it seems the Prime Minister doesn't know what their own rules are at the moment. So it, you know, and in a crisis, having ambivalent, confused messaging is probably the worst you can do. And it doesn't help if you're also competing with a lot of misinformation that is, you know, even more far out. But, you know, how do you navigate that space? Very difficult.
I think everyone around the room is probably virtually nodding, like I am. The next question is, do you think social media, I don't know if this is social media as a community or social media in terms of the agencies that run it, does enough to stop the spread of fake news.
Does it do enough to stop it?
Yeah.
Right. That's an interesting question to ask, because usually it's a great way of phrasing it, because the way I usually hear the question is social media at fault for everything? And well, it's the same question, just flipped around. And I think, well, the answer is nuanced. What we do know for sure is that social media can have a very detrimental effect on public discourse. In fact, there is now evidence from very clever studies looking at it statistically that social media can be causally responsible for things such as ethnic hate crimes. There are ways of showing that. We also know that the people who consume social media the most are the ones who are least likely to comply with, social distancing measures and all that. So I think social media does play a role, and it isn't always constructive, to say the least. So does social media do enough to stop misinformation? No. I don't think so. I think it does plenty to spread it. I'm not sure it does enough to stop it. Now, again, it's, there's always another side to that story. When it comes to COVID, Facebook has done stuff that they for years claimed they were incapable of doing, which is to identify misinformation and flag it as false and keep people from sharing it, or reducing the sharing by 95% simply by overlaying the information with a warning that it was false. So the social media platforms have done something. Twitter has done similar things. But in my personal opinion, no, that was not enough. More could be done.
And Tracey, anything to add?
Can I add something to that? So I think my observation on the kind of false information and questioning by Facebook is that certainly those people around the fringes of the conspiracy stuff, for them it's been incendiary that's happened, and in a lot of ways has kind of reinforced. If you think of social media as a place of social contact, it's reinforced the clubbiness around those things. What it's also done is it's hugely, and particularly where things have been taken down, so the banning side of things has been absolutely counterproductive. So people like David Icke really thrive on the idea that they're sticking it to authority. They're not really sticking it to anyone. I've never seen him ask a penetrating question on a difficult issue in my life. But of course, if he gets banned, then it just really proves it to the hordes of people that come through his site. Coming through his site, of course, is interesting to him because it's monetized on social media, and basically every click you go through on YouTube, of course, increases the value of any advertising that appears on his channel, and that's what's interesting to David Icke. I expect it's particularly interesting at a time when he can't have his mass rallies any longer, which also make thousands and thousands of dollars for him. So I think the demonetizing effort is probably the most interesting that's happened, far more than the kind of stopping a judgment on it. It's interesting because it enables me, certainly in the arguments with these things, when I get into the real difficult weeds with this stuff, it enables me to point out that it's interesting how quiet some people become when they're not monetized any longer, that their commitment to the cause and the leading the charge suddenly seems to fall away when they don't make the money out of YouTube that they once did. And that's been quite interesting. It's just putting that on the, let's deploy some of that skeptical view towards the leaders of these movements, and I think that's certainly an area that's important. Demoting, I think, is better than banning. I mean, demoting, all that really does, it doesn't take people from their rightful place. What it does is it counters the really poor algorithms that many social media platforms were using, that saw people becoming ever more concentrated and concentrated. You like this, so you're probably like this, or like this, more extreme, more extreme, more extreme. And we've seen this in extremism movements, with the whole Islamization or Islamic extremist thing, that people become more concentrated. We've seen it in child pornography, which obviously rather in more narrow part of society. But But we see it in this, it just drives people down those channels, and now they're trying to kind of stop that and correct for that. And I think that's, so demoting and demonetizing, I think, are the far more crucial things that the platforms need to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely, but let me just add one other thing to that, and that I think is introducing friction, making it slightly harder to get to stuff. Banning, I'm not in favor of, except for clearly illegal stuff like incitement to hatred and, you know, genocide and all that. I mean, we don't have to talk about that because we got laws in place to do that. But things like, you know, requiring another click or requiring some thinking before people access problematic information, that tiny bit of friction can be sufficient to make a huge difference to the spread of misinformation. And so once you encounter it, despite all the demoting, you know, just make it a little harder to share. And in fact, Twitter has done that recently to some extent by asking people whether they really want to share something that they haven't read. Twitter kept track of whether people actually read stuff before they retweet it. And if you haven't read it, they say, whoa, 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 do you really want to do that? Now, you can still do it, but it's sort of kind of a reminder, a little bit of friction that, hey, maybe you should think about this a bit more. And that tends to be very effective. And I would add that as another step to the two you've mentioned.
No, good discussion. I'm going to ask that we keep going because we have a few questions and they're all really interesting. Still to come. So if there's any last minute questions, I'm only going to accept one or two more, if assuming Steve and Tracey can keep up the pace. Do you, as Steve, you presented examples of scientists and the increased trust in sciences. How do you think trust in government has changed during the pandemic?
Interesting. I don't have data for the UK. What I do have are opinion polls in various European countries. What comes to mind is Italy and Germany, where one of the consequences of the pandemic, an apparent consequence, has been the reduction in support for for far-right populist parties. Salvini in Italy has done not that well this year. In Germany, the approval of the government is somewhere around 90% of the handling of the pandemic, and Germany has a very low incidence of COVID at the moment. So I know that, you know, stuff has happened there that was very encouraging. In the UK, I don't have any data. Tracey, do you know about trust surveys?
So YouGov is showing approval in the sense of people approve of the latest. So YouGov's tracking people's approval of the government's measures, and they're reasonably high. I mean, that's 70% approved.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which was quite surprising actually. But I think myself reflected, it was that poll was the latest one, was done just off the back of a real anti-young people sort of drive. Young people were going out and partying and then messing in with COVID, and I think it probably reflected some sort of sense in which people felt relieved that government had stepped in on that, and so we'll see how that trend bears out. I would just say yesterday, Sense About Science is the global partner for community engagement on the new World Risk Poll that Gallup's done with the Lloyd's Register Foundation. It's the first poll of the whole world, pretty much 142 countries, 150,000 people, on risk perception and risk experience. And it's lots of questions in there about trust. And because it's a 10-year project, it ran last year, at the end of last year, and it's going to run again at the beginning of next year. So watch this space, because it'd be really interesting globally to see how COVID has influenced people's trust in institutions. And it's a good set of questions, because it's not just do you trust, it was a set of questions of do you trust them to provide you with information, keep you safe, those kinds of things. And I think that's been a really interesting question. Certainly the whole thing about who do you trust to keep you safe? Who do you trust to manage stuff at a time of crisis? It's changed the trust question. So do look out for that. I mean, it's another year in the making, but good that we're going to have these two data sets to look at globally.
Okay. Sounds good. I'm going to skip on because it's a related question. about government messaging, and obviously we're in Scotland, virtual Scotland. Do people have any comparing and contrasting about the messaging coming from, I suppose, the devolved governments and how that is helping? Because you spoke about the UK, but obviously Scotland's got a different route, as is Wales and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, very quickly, I think Nicola Sturgeon did quite well at the beginning compared to ours, the kind of the difference in openness and levelling with people, regardless of whether you think different governments are taking the right approach. She definitely came off better in that communication, particularly sort of around the mid-time, around April, May. Northern Ireland, I think, have suffered from the fact that they went for the worst case scenario communication, which then meant they really, really rapidly lost credibility as people began to see that it clearly wasn't that scenario. And then they've struggled a bit to recover from that. So although now seem to be doing rather well. So I think those are my main observations.
Steve, anything quick to add? We've got two more that I want to get to.
No, I don't have any data on that. And yeah, anecdotally, I share Tracey's perception, but I don't have data, so I don't really want to speculate.
That's great. Okay, another question. What is the most dangerous conspiracy theory about climate change that you've come across? Well,
any conspiracy theory that keeps people from taking the problem seriously. You know, I actually don't care what the conspiracy theory is, in the sense of I don't have any personal interest in understanding them. You know, why would I want to? I'm only interested in their consequences on people's attitudes and behavior. And as far as that is concerned, to the best of my knowledge, any conspiracy theory is as bad as any other. You know, people will reject scientific evidence, or they will, you know, refuse to reduce their carbon footprint if they're exposed to a conspiracy about it. They'll reduce their intention to vaccinate if they're exposed to conspiracy theories about vaccinations. And so, I mean, what I'm concerned about is the consequence, the fallout, not you know, and to the best of my knowledge, the fallout from all these theories is pretty much the same. So yeah, I can't really nominate a theory I find the worst.
Can I just add? Yeah, can I just briefly add that I think the most problematic is where behaviour on the part of the research community has been less than you'd want it to be. So the UEA thing about the emails around, if people remember, around sort of trying to doctor a little bit the way that the results were being presented, which didn't necessarily justify the criticisms that came about that. But at the same time, it wasn't the kind of behaviour that all of you wanted to get behind. And stick up for.
Well, it certainly was interpreted that way. I mean, no, actually, you know, I mean, they've had what, 8 inquiries?
I know, yeah.
The world, and they all exonerated those scientists. So, I mean, what happened there was just a propaganda coup for the people who were able to cherry pick these emails and confabulate a conspiracy theory. So and in that sense, yes, that was. You know, that was in fact one that probably did have a negative fallout. Although if you ask people anything about it now, it turns out that outside the very small group of aficionados, no one remembers this. And in the US, it actually had no effect on public opinion at all. So I don't think even that wasn't terrible. It was bad enough, but it wasn't terrible.
Yeah, I highlight it because I think that the times that things become difficult are when other good voices get driven from the scene. So, you know, you're confronted by somebody's apparently rather questionable email and you feel like, I don't want to be defending that when I don't know what's behind that or what that's all about. And I think the same thing, you know, when government behaves in a way that's less than you'd want it to be. Again, you know, if it's over a vaccine, then you end up with good independent voices hanging back and going, I don't want to be associated with that. So that's when it's damaging, is when it drives other people from you know, communicating and supporting things.
Okay, there is one question which I think is right up Tracey's street, given the discussions we were having before we started. Do you recommend engaging with conspiracy theorists or ignore and focus on getting good science out?
Right. Depends who you are. It really
Yeah.
depends who you are and how you think you're likely to do and what there is, you know, for you in that. Because one thing I don't recommend is zoning in on, you know, on a particular viewpoint and just trying to win that battle out there on the fringes. You know, it's that kind of you wrestle with a pig, you both get dirty thing. And I don't think you end up coming off too well by picking that argument. I've long encouraged, for example, medical researchers who want to take issue with miracle cures to try and set the agenda themselves as much as possible, rather than to appear to go out chasing the spoon bending kind of world, because you just end up looking like you're part of that, or you know, it's not edifying for anyone. So I do recommend that. However, where I think it's different is not to be to understand that these sort of theories are, they're in a transient way, are going through sort of popular discussion all the time. And there are many people who perhaps don't even fall into the categories that Steve outlined of being dispositional or being overly pragmatic. They're kind of pragmatic, but in a really transient way, which is like, this just, you know, just speaks to my pissed offness for the next 5 minutes kind of thing, and I'll share it. And so I think it's really important not to over exaggerate that, or to read from that there's nothing to play for in those conversations. So just sort of be quite relaxed about it is what I would say when it comes to talking about your own research. But try and set your own agenda. And the best way to try and set your own agenda is to tell people what the question is that needs to be answered. Right? Don't set the agenda by saying, here's my wonderful thing I found that answer to a question you never thought of having, but actually explain why the question is important, and then it forces you to think about why that's important to anyone else apart from you, and what social value there might be to having a conversation about it. You know, not all research needs to be shared with everybody.
Yeah, and Steve, I'm nodding for some other reason. I'll talk to you after that. Steve, any last comments from yourself on the topic?
Well, I think it not only does it depend on who you are, it also depends on who you're talking to, or who you think you might be talking to. Because one of the most important things in this entire arena is audience segmentation. You know, you got to figure out who you're talking to. And there are some people who, you know, if they're dispositionally inclined to believe in conspiracy theories, where any communicative effort is possibly wasted unless you want to spend several years of your life, you know, dedicated to talking to that one person. But there are other people who, you know, for whom a correction is actually welcome and who are responsive to that. I mean, the research shows that it is possible to correct many people, not everybody, but many people, even when they articulate conspiracy theories, at least some of the time and partially. Now, I would never say it's all going to be great and successful, but it's not catastrophic either. And I think that's an important thing. You know, it's a relatively positive message for, you know, for some people. And the tricky thing is to find out who you're talking to, and you probably won't find that out until halfway through the conversation. So that's the difficulty.
Okay, we've gone slightly over, but I was enjoying the conversation too much,
yes,
and that was the last question. So I want to thank everyone who stayed with us. I particularly want to thank Steve and Tracey. It's been fascinating, topical, and hopefully everyone enjoyed it, and some really good questions too. So on that note, I think I have to do something, or somebody else will do something for me, but we'll say goodbye.
Okay. Take care. Bye.